Well, congratulations first of all on making it to the right room. Hopefully you're in the right room. If you're here for planning, great. If you're here for PropTech, you're in the wrong place. Are we all good? Okay. Right. You're not allowed to leave. No, seriously, thank you for joining us for this last session of the day. So we're going to be talking about de-risking planning. But before we get into that, let me say that introduce myself and say a bit more about the context for the session. So I'm Sarah Chilcott, and I have spent the last 16 years working in and around the planning profession. I'm not a planner, but I do understand a fair bit about the process and the system, the ecosystem around the planning process. Up until last year, I was Managing Director of the Planning Portal, which is the national digital platform that allows people to submit planning applications across England, so working with all the councils. And so I come at this, as I say, with an understanding of the system and the processes around it. Why I'm here is because I've been working, since I left the Planning Portal last year, I've been working as a business and board advisor, and one of the organisations I've been working very closely with is the Housing Festival, trying to help them work through some of the elements that came through in the playbook that was published last year in relation to planning, and trying to help kind of fix that component of the system and think about how we can move that kind of the elements of that playbook forward at a system level. So if you were in the sessions earlier, you would have heard a lot of talk, I'm sure, about some of the challenges, of course, around temporary accommodation and homelessness, and our real desire to get more homes built for people. But that it's a real system challenge, it's a wicked challenge, as Jez described it earlier. And of course, planning is a critical component of that system. And planning is in a difficult place at the moment in terms of capacity. So again, if you were in the session earlier, you would have heard me say that local authorities in particular are under-resourced. There is a lot of strain in the planning system in terms of the obligations that are put into the system. There's been a lot more complexity added over recent years in terms of environmental protections and building safety, and lots of very important things, but planning has become a bit of a catch-all for all of those problems, all of those policy changes. So fewer planners, more things to deal with, and so it's in that context that we recognise that we need to do something different in the planning system, that if we just keep working through the same processes we work through in terms of individual applications, then we aren't going to get the number of homes built at the speed that we need them to be built at to fix this crisis. So that's the kind of context for the panel today. I'm going to ask the panellists just to introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll start into some questions. So, over to you.
So good afternoon all, and thanks to Housing Festival for inviting me to speak here today. So I work as the Assistant Director for Havering Council. I've been there for 5 years, and ultimately I've seen since COVID, a really sort of growing emergency appearing in the temporary accommodation sector. And that challenge has meant that I've gone out to see families in hotels and in other sort of high-cost accommodation at real risk and not quite clear about what their future is going to look like. And that's where some of the work I've been doing with our exhibition, which is upstairs for the 18 units of modular accommodation, has come in. That we are starting to look at other solutions to meet the existential challenge that we've got. So that's where we are. In terms of our spend, which is pretty much where local authorities are also concerned, we are a local authority that's on the brink of bankruptcy. I suspect that's going to be the same for many other London boroughs, but our spend isn't confined to our homeless spend, but also our social care spend. And that's the thing that we are starting to bring into the conversation around how do we look at schemes. We look at generally through the lens of the viability of the individual scheme itself, but actually we should be thinking about the spend of local authorities as well, to have that conversation about what can we do to meet the growing need.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of that. Yes, Jonathan.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi everyone, I'm John Bauer and I'm a partner. I head up planning at law firm Womble Bond Dickinson, and we're delighted to be supporting the Housing Festival. In fact, I was having to look back to see when I first got involved in the Housing Festival. I think it was about 2018 or so. And I'm passionate about social mobility, and part of that is ensuring that everyone has got a safe home to live in. And the work that I do and colleagues do is the full range of housing, garden villages, but also advising government on the asylum accommodation programme. So we're seeing the full spectrum of the challenges that there are in housing. And one aspect that we've been looking at is how we can navigate the planning system to make sure that we can use existing tools to find solutions, and we'll come on to that shortly, no doubt.
Certainly will. Thank you. Mary.
Thank you. Afternoon, everybody. I'm Mary Crew. I'm Senior Associate at Stantec. I'm a planner who I've just been sort of led by Jonathan to mention in terms of planning tools that are out there. At the risk of being a one-trick pony, I have a lot of interest in local development orders. I don't know, I'm looking at a sea of faces, I don't even know what point I'm starting from. If anybody knows what they are a useful planning tool, at least I think they've proven to be, and they are potentially something that we'd like to discuss today as reflecting on some of the conversations earlier today. There's no silver bullet, but certainly I'm a firm believer that a planning tool available to local authorities and indeed to the private sector using a local development order as opposed to the traditional TCPA route through planning is an efficient way to achieve development at pace, and there is a good case study material to reflect on to see that that's happening. So the benefit being last on today is we can sort of reflect on lots of the discussions today, and one thing that struck me is not reinventing the wheel. If you get a model that works, replicate it, roll it out at scale, and you'll see results. So I think with the local development order, what we are aiming to achieve now and supporting Sarah and colleagues is to use the LDO as a model that could be a really positive planning tool to cumulatively collect small-ish brownfield sites and deliver them at scale, several sites in one go through one LDO, and deliver housing at pace. And to reflect on the very first speaker today, Lord Best, talking about the challenges of the blockers. To me, that resonated in terms of some of the statutory consultees holding things up, it's been reflected on today. An LDO serves to front load planning and get all those people on board to help deliver, rather than come to them with a planning application and then face a barrage of what can sometimes appear to be criticism and sort of blocking. So we're hoping to be able to roll that out more widely to address the challenges that we've been talking about today.
Great, thank you, Mary. Russell.
Hi everyone, I'm Russell Curtis. I'm an architect and director of RCKA, but I have an unhealthy interest in planning. I think it's fair to say that a lot of planners that I've spoken to kind of feel like they wanted to do architecture, but I think maybe in the wrong career. Actually, an architect really should have done planning, but anyway, there you go. I've done, so we were responsible for designing the module that's out in the Crescent at the moment with Roll Along and Waits. But I've also written some planning policies. So I wrote Lewisham's Small Sites Supplementary Planning Document, which is an adopted strategy for small sites. We just concluded a piece of work for Ealing Council where we've done a piece of analysis on all their land holdings, and then developed a West London pattern book for small sites and MMC which is funded by the GLA, by the Small Site Small Builders funding. And we've also just concluded a piece of work for Lewisham Council, funded by MHCLG's PropTech Round 4, where we've developed an AI tool that identifies small sites with a view to influencing the London Plan small sites targets, and trying to encourage the London boroughs to massively ramp up their small site delivery, because we think, certainly looking across Lewisham, there's potential capacity for perhaps 4 or 5 times the number of small site developments they currently have allocated in the local plan, in the London Plan rather. So a lot of planning and small sites related things, and I'm really interested. We also work with developers, also both house builders and for local authorities doing direct delivery of affordable homes, and so we see it from both sides, and it's frustrating.
Yes, and to take that point, I should have asked at the beginning, have we got any planners in the room?
Are you a local authority planner or
GLA?
GLA, okay, of course I should know that, shouldn't I?
So I would say, having worked around planning for 16 years, that, you know, particularly in recent years, unfortunately, planning's had quite a bad press. It's seen as a blocker. That's absolutely not what this panel is about. I think all of these panellists have got huge experience of working with the planning system, and hopefully what you'll get from today's session is a kind of some real positive takeaways in terms of how planning can be an enabler, because that's what it should be. You know, planners don't go into planning because they want to stop things being built. They go in because they want to create beautiful places that people can live and work and sustainable. So, yeah, I think the challenges around resource are really creating a kind of a really bad narrative around planning, which is not helpful in the long term. So, in that context, Darren, I was talking earlier about the kind of some of the different policies that have been layered on to planning and some of those kind of balances that planners have to make. I know you've been in Havering, you've been doing some work around demountable schemes for temporary accommodation. So I just wonder if you could share some kind of reflections on how that's worked in relation to planning colleagues and the kind of lessons learned through that process.
And I think it's important we're still going through that process as well. So we have submitted an application recently, a temporary application for those 18 units, demountable units. But I think the key thing, and I almost wear 2 hats, so I've done a sort of regeneration as well as homelessness and temporary accommodation. So I've seen almost both sides of the planning aspect from that. And when I speak to planners with a temporary accommodation homelessness hat on, the thought that I get from planners is that there's a sense of a bad deal. And that's generally around sort of land availability, and then what proportion of the policy, you know, whether we can achieve a 35% or 50% of the units to be affordable or not. And then when that number slowly dwindles to 10-15%, then the question is, well, what deal is the local authority getting? So I think that's where planning sometimes comes from as well. And then the other aspect is, okay, if we are getting that portion of it, what portion of it is going to actually meet the local need? And then, so with my homelessness and temporary accommodation hat on, I then think of, well, what percentage of those units are going to go to people who actually need the properties? Generally, people on the waiting list aren't the people that need the properties, and the waiting list acts as that almost the info, information of what people, what the projected need is in the borough. So there's almost a sort of two ends to that. So I'm planning's friend when I'm homeless and temporary accommodation, and we have those sort of robust conversations, and we try to get as much from the deal as we possibly can. From a regen perspective, understanding that there's obviously the envelope of the scheme as well, and what that viability looks like, and that goes back to my earliest point around what is viability. How do we look at it, not just through the lens of you know, a single scheme and the cost of that scheme, but where does social care come into it, etc. And I find sometimes when you're designing or writing a local plan, sometimes the detail in that plan around actual need in the borough gets a little bit lost, plans then go out of date, and then to claw back all of that, it can really be a challenge. So for planners themselves as well, trying to, act like the jigsaw sort of person, it's a difficult challenge to balance need versus scheme viability as well. So those are sort of the core challenges that I found.
Yeah, and particularly with those schemes where you're looking at a percentage of affordable, that's a story I've heard time and time again in terms of kind of where that threshold is in terms of viability. You could have a separate discussion around what affordable means, I'm sure, but this is not perhaps not the context of that. Jonathan, let me turn to you then. In just thinking about planning policy in a kind of slightly broader sense, your experiences around that, and particularly if you've got anything in relation to small sites.
Yes, I mean, the starting point is obviously stark, and I think it was only yesterday the government sort of reiterated the number of households in temporary accommodation, the number of families and children in bed and breakfast, but actually the statistics are stark, but actually the reality, what we heard earlier from Caroline when she was talking about the reality of families, expectant mothers, etc., just brings home to me how serious it is. And so looking at this, and in particular for local authority owned land, what the options are, it's probably helpful if I sort of set out some of what the options are, and then I'll touch on briefly local development orders, and Mary will no doubt give some more detail. But if we're starting from a blank sheet of paper, and that's what we did when looking at sort of small site strategy, is what are the options that collectively the developers with local authorities, or local authorities on their own can be looking at to try and solve the problem, particularly when local authorities own a number of small sites. And I'll come on to some of the other points relating to that from an ownership perspective in a moment. But do we promote them through the local plan? It takes time. Do we have some supplementary planning documents that Russ talked about? Again, it takes a lot of time. Individual planning applications for sites. Well, if you were to aggregate the amount of time that's taken in each individual site, the number of reports you're preparing, the duplication is significant. It places great pressure on the applicant, whoever that might be, places even more greater pressure on a resource-constrained local authority. Could we look at agreements in relation to land, Section 106 agreements, etc., to regulate the use of land? Well, of course, that doesn't of itself give planning permission, and if it's on local authority owned land, they can't enter into Section 106 agreements with themselves. Can we look at permitted development rights? Well, again, it takes time. What we're looking at is how can we find a solution which uses the existing regime, and so tweaks to the permitted development orders need government time, and that's, whilst we have got the planning bill coming forward in the spring, that's not something that we want to be utilising. Can we look at redeveloping existing sites? And Caroline also spoke there about the issues you deal with if you're looking to refurbish, or if you're looking to increase density on existing sites, and the need to secure tenant approvals and so on. I've done a number of regeneration schemes where there are quite rightly the necessary protections in place for council tenants, but how can you actually go through that redevelopment process? And so settled on looking at local development orders, and I can't remember when first sort of raised this point. It just seemed to me as being I'd go out and say sort of an ingenious solution, and something that's not really utilised as much. They've been around for 21 years now. I mean, I won't necessarily ask for a show of hands in the room, but local development orders are not often talked about. There's another order which I spoke in intro about how I've been advising government in relation to the asylum accommodation programme. We've been advising them on special development orders, which only government can promote, but these development orders that are prescribed in existing legislation but just not often utilised. They've got clear policy support in the NPPF, particularly in relation to small sites, but also where it talks about their acceptable where they promote economic, social or environmental gains for an area, clearly that's a real opportunity here. But what is one? It grants planning permission for development. It can grant planning permission for specific sites or for a range of sites, or even across the whole of a local authority's area. We've been advising, not in the housing space, but we've been advising Bristol City Council in relation to the district heating local development order. And if you look at the map which accompanies the local development order, the whole of Bristol is covered by this. So every single road in Bristol is coloured in on this map because there is planning permission in relation to a district heating scheme. So it shows the scale of how it can be used. But how do you then go about controlling development? So you need a statement of reasons which needs to be approved by the local authority to set out the justification why you're promoting it. There are conditions attached with it. There can be a need to comply with design codes. But it's also important to just stress that it needs to comply with all environmental controls. So if it's environmental, if an environmental impact assessment is required, then that would need to be complied with if there's any habitat regulation issues as well. But the other points I just wanted to touch on, which is outside of planning, but in terms of what you need political buy-in, obviously. If local authorities are looking to dispose of the interest in the land through a long lease, they need to secure best value, and that's something which can't be forgotten at the outset of the process. Another thing is local authority holds a number of cards when it comes to bringing sites forward, one of which is using their statutory powers. So a lot of the small sites might be former garage sites or open space, and if it's open space that could open a whole another can of worms which we won't go into. But suffice to say that local authorities can use what's called a power of appropriation to overcome any third-party interests on land. So if there is a right of way through a site, then they can what's called override that right, and whilst it can generate a compensation claim, it allows you to actually bring that site forward, which ordinarily a developer might struggle with. And also just to flag it, a lot of these sites might be on land owned for housing purposes, even if they're already vacant, and so there might need to be a need to get Secretary of State consent in relation to disposal. But crucially, what we've sought to do as part of the work on small sites is bring together existing regimes, utilise them, and hopefully bring those to market at scale to achieve a solution, which is ultimately, we know that planning can be a barrier, but equally we see this as an enabler to bring forward development.
Yeah, great, thank you. And Mary's going to expand a little bit on local development orders. I think, as you say, Jonathan, they've been around for a very long time, but certainly with the people that I've spoken to over a number of years, there seems to be much more awareness about them being used in large single sites, but that's not your experience, Mary, necessarily.
No, I mean, I think the main thing about LDOs is they are designed so that they're as flexible as possible. You know, I'm not the lawyer, but I can tell you the statute associated with LDOs is very thin. There are not many, you can't do this, you can't do that. It is literally, your LDO should be designed to best fit the circumstances. So they are tailored to meet the requirement of what it is you're trying to achieve. And I've had the benefit of working on numerous LDOs now, and the important thing at the beginning is to nail your vision. What is it you want to do? And I'm working on a big LDO for a gigafactory at the moment in Somerset, so that's quite different from seeing small sites come off for resi, but it doesn't matter as long as you know what it is you want to achieve. And Jonathan referred to your statement of reasons. That's where you set out what your LDO is doing, reading a bit like a policy. So it can do whatever you want it to do, as long as you're certain on what outcome you're achieving. And the onus on the LDO is to achieve it at pace. It's an efficient way to see what you want to do, and deliver it. And I'm just reflecting earlier, there was a question asked about land banking and lots, and the response to that was, we don't think there's a problem with land banking, but there's a problem with extant consents not being delivered, and that's because a period of time has elapsed between the consent and actually getting a spade in the ground. LDOs are trying to front load everything, or do in fact front load everything, so all that risk, all that uncertainty, all the issues associated with viability are baked into the LDO. When the LDO is adopted, that's your consent. And then what is developed just goes through a relatively simple process of compliance. So it's very speedy from adoption to going through compliance to starting. And that is reflected in a lot of sites now for various different reasons. It's efficient, it's quick, and it was born out of a criticism of the planning system from being too slow and clunky, and reflecting on the LDO guidance that I was involved in. There has been, the beginning of LDOs, it's been a bit of a slow burn, local authorities not being very keen on something that's new. LDO is, you know, perceived as a new approach, something different. Why would you want to do it like that? But I think the proof of the pudding is what has been delivered through LDOs to date has been good, and it's been successful, and it's been quick. And the King was at Nansledden last week. That was an LDO. What did Nansledden do? It set the parameters very, very clearly, with a very, very clear vision about what needed to be achieved. And then it was delivered, and it's been to be successful. And lots of issues have been baked into the LDO to do with stewardship, to make sure that the legacy of what the LDO tried to deliver is there in perpetuity. So it's not, you know, fly by night, it'll look scruffy in a few years. So it's allowing your LDO, as I keep saying, to meet the needs of what you're trying to deliver. And I think from an administrative development control side of things, Jonathan was talking about in Bristol, used for sort of utilities type stuff. There is an absolute prime model that can be used for local authorities to develop small sites, brownfield sites, where the parameters are set in terms of design, in terms of the niggly things that sometimes get in the way of negotiating a planning permission on parking and things. Roll that out across the local authority, and then roll it out across many local authorities. Wouldn't that be a really positive planning tool in action to get brownfield sites away? And I think what I've heard today is that, you know, there's a real place to do that, and I think the tool is there. So encouraging local authorities to grab that tool and use it could be really good. And just lastly, we talked a lot about sort of government today, haven't we, and ministers and high-level stuff, but I think my experience of LDOs is it works really well at the local politics stage. So we've all been to, well, I've been to lots of planning committees where your application might be discussed in a room like this, and you sit there and think, why are these ward members niggling about this and that? And, you know, it's very frustrating. With an LDO, as I mentioned, you front load everything, and that includes your consultation with statutory consultees, with ward members, local politicians. What do we all want to achieve collectively? Let's agree, for the larger LDOs I've done, a memorandum of understanding. We'll all sign it, and we'll all agree this is what we're trying to achieve. Are we all on board? Yes. Are we collectively all going to do our bit in this bigger picture to deliver it? Yes. When the LDO is adopted, do you politicians want to take all the credit? Yes. Well, that's fine. But at the end of the day, you did what you set out to do. And I think reflecting on some of the successful LDOs we've delivered, that has been really powerful. So it's not just the big picture stuff. It's getting through the nitty-gritty of planning, which is sometimes very frustrating, that an LDO allows you to do that.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And I think we've heard a lot, certainly today, and I'm sure yesterday as well, around collaboration and how you don't want to, you know, try and do everything all at once, but actually if we can work together to move this problem forward, then that's the right way to go. So this is a great tool in that context as well, I think. And Russell, this is a good point to draw you in, because if you're going to go early to communities and statutory consultees, and you're going to consult really early, again, we've heard questions and conversations during the day about the challenge of getting things through planning and the resistance from communities. And you've got a lot of experience of using design codes, so maybe you could just explain a little bit how that might fit into this model.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting intersection between a number of things that we've been doing. So the work we've done for Ealing has been specifically looking at Ealing's own land holdings. So, well, we've put a database together of all the sites that it owns, and then we've developed an Ealing specific or West London specific design code, which is predominantly housing. And Ealing's adopted a position where it wants TA and affordable housing to be completely, not only space standards compliant, but actually the best practice London Housing Design Guide, so 10% above space standards. And so what we've done is we've developed a series of house types which could be delivered using modular. Now we've been very explicit that it should be system agnostic, because there's a lot of horror stories from across London of where authorities have got into bed with a modular provider very early on and locked themselves into a system, and then there's been problems with it, or supply chain, or they've gone bust or whatever it is. And so we were very keen that this should be a set of parameters rather than built design around a system. We did a lot of market engagement with providers, worked out a range of things like wall build-ups and that sort of stuff. But there's also it's like a recipe. There's components that you can bring together that reflect the West London sort of character. So there's that bit, and that's for Ealing. But in Lewisham, we've done this bit of work looking at small sites. So we wrote the SPD, and then we developed this AI tool that assesses the whole of a borough, and it could be applied to anywhere else, and it finds all the sites. And the thing we're interested in doing is systemizing the approach to delivery. So could we, for example, use the AI to identify clusters of similar sites, and then use that as perhaps not to define the LDO boundary, but at least to know where to look for potential LDOs. So we know, for example, that there are certain parts of Lewisham where there are 15 to 20 small estates, so not the big estate regen projects, but small estates where you've got blocks of flats with garages or open or hard standing or something. Those sit within let's say none of those are within any further than maybe a couple of 100 metres from one another. Could we look at an LDO across the whole area and pair that with a design code? We say, well, here's a design code that we've created. Here are all the sites. Either we decide on an LDO for those individual sites, or we look at an area-wide LDO, and providing that we're meeting the criteria around proximity to the boundary and heights and all the things that you want to lock into the LDO, perhaps that's a way of doing it. And could we do several of those across the borough? So I think there's a really interesting kind of overlap. And also that should unlock development for private developers. I mean, if people have got sites within that LDO area, providing that they are coming forward with a scheme that meets the pattern book parameters, that's fine too, because it's also as much about private small sites as it is about council-led housing development. But I think it needs to be it's getting the balance right between flexibility, making sure that your design code is not so tightly tightened that there's no flexibility in it, but also making sure that what you're coding is of sufficient quality as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. I'm going to come to the audience for questions in just a second. But Russ, just to follow up on that, my understanding of design code, so it would help with the visualisation of the building in terms of the pattern book as you describe it.
Exactly.
But it's also the rules on the site, so it might apply to the density of the housing, or how far from the boundary, or...
That's right. So I mean, we obviously, in Lewisham, if we're talking about Lewisham for a second, Lewisham has an SPD around small sites, and that sets parameters. So it doesn't really it doesn't prescribe a design approach. It doesn't say that they must, homes must look like this or that, or must use this material. It's quite broad, but it does set parameters around heights and proximity to existing buildings. So, for example, a lot of local plans will say something about habitable room distances must be reasonable. Okay, well, what's reasonable? That's useless. I mean, my idea of what's reasonable is different to somebody else's. So in the SPD, we said, well, one of the things that we want is clarity, so we're going to define it at 16 metres. So introduce some certainty. So anybody coming forward with a scheme that has, distance between habitable rooms is 60 metres. If it's any less than that, it's not acceptable. Any more than that is acceptable. So it's trying to remove some of that uncertainty. But that's a design guide. The design code is much more about what the thing looks like. I think that's the important difference. Design code should do this, and I think that's where when we start to talk about the LDOs and what we're allowing. I think for small sites, it needs to be reasonably prescriptive, because otherwise, I mean, one of the interesting things about the work we've done with Lewisham, part of the PropTech piece of work, is also analysing their planning history. And you look across the whole of the borough, and some of the planning applications that we've seen are absolutely shocking. I mean, shockingly bad. And you think, well, how did anybody even think that, draw it and then put that in and think that was going to be acceptable? It's amazing. So, and there's also brilliant stuff happening in Lewisham. There's some fantastic exemplars for small sites. Now, the reality is that design code sits somewhere in the middle of those things, so it prevents the crap, but it also probably suppresses the absolute gems. But that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. It's a good point. And to come back, it doesn't really deal with some of the viability stuff that you touched on, Darren, at the beginning. But the small site strategy, as it's emerging from the playbook and this conversation around planning that we've been leading, is different, because it's not about a mixed scheme. So the viability is, the funding comes through a different model. So it's that's the link there. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes just for questions, because I know we started just a little bit late. So has anyone got any burning questions that they want to ask our panel? Yes. As we've got a mic, we're just going to shout. But yeah, back then.
Hi, possibly a question for Jonathan or Mary.
Yeah.
LDOs, local development orders, we've spoken about them in the context of smaller sites. Would they work for larger sites, and how would you deal with the interplay between the initial grant of consent and things like Section 106 agreements to make sure that the affordable housing requirements or infrastructure, whatever, are captured when you grant that consent up front?
In short, yes. I mean, there are examples of really large housing-led LDOs. Mary touched on I can't remember how many million square feet it is, the Gigafactory in a notes, but both our practices worked on that. But yes, you can secure things like affordable housing through Section 106. You can deal with phasing as well, and that's sort of a critical aspect, as well as obviously the delivery of the infrastructure up front. So it is, in terms of as flexible as they can get, it is probably it's as flexible as probably any development through a permitted development order, albeit you would have the control through conditions and Section 106 as well. Is there anything else you want to add? I'm not an expert in LDOs, but Section 106, you can't impose Section 106 on LDOs, can you? You can negotiate it afterwards. You can negotiate, yeah.
Yeah, but it has to be the applicants that.
No, you apply it through a condition.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yes. But yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. Sorry. It's interesting.
Great. Thank you. There was another question. Yeah.
Laura from the Building Centre. Probably a bit less detailed than LDOs and design codes, but thinking about the public perception of planning and some sort of issues that may be more in mainstream media around grey belt or change of use, and sort of thinking about then how does that impact on councillors and decisions that they make to represent their communities, and somebody earlier on said we need to move past the NIMBYs stopping things now and get this moving. I just wondered what you thought as professionals about that sort of public piece around planning and social housing. Sorry to
anybody want to take that one?
Well, I think there's been a lot of talk today about the housing crisis being an emergency, and when people have talked about the climate emergency, I think, you know, it's got to be quick, and I think there's a recognition of that now, and I think perhaps local plans are notoriously slow, and you know, by the time you've written your local plan, it's out of date, and you kind of LDOs have been used to sort of plug that gap where the plans between cycles and the councils realise actually we've got to need to do something, be it deliver a strategic employment site or something quite different, you know, deal with their stock of brownfield small sites, for example. So I think it comes back to that vision. If you can reflect early on in the process and consult and try and shape that vision in conjunction with talking to local communities, etc., so they're on board with shaping that vision, I think that helps you to deliver faster. If that answers your question.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this because I mean, we sit on both sides of the fence, and we've had a very, very frustrating journey through planning on a small site recently, and this sort of touches on viability as well, because viability, certainly for small scale developers, depends on planning. You know, and the longer it takes, I mean, you know, 6 months. Delay in a planning decision can make the difference between a project being profitable or not on small sites. So it's really tricky, and we've had I'm a little bit sceptical about. Well, we need to be a bit careful when we're talking about councillors and planning officers and where the responsibility lies for, you know, delays and things. I mean, I think London perhaps is slightly different, or certainly central London. But actually, a lot of the councillors that I've met and talked to absolutely get this and are, you know, fully behind housing delivery. And I've had conversations with planning officers where they are the ones that are holding projects up, not because they're being belligerent, but because there's so much to weigh up, and there'll be lots of loud voices, and they don't have the confidence, particularly on smaller schemes, to make positive decisions. And we had a scheme recently, we went to a planning committee, and it was almost refused under delegated powers because the heritage officer had sent a 9-page report in saying, well, given all the reasons why it shouldn't be approved, we managed to get it called into committee, and heritage did not come up once in the discussion and was unanimously approved. And so the ward councillors, the planning committee, are very, very sensible. And I think one of the things I'm really keen about LDOs and the mechanisms like that and design codes is that it means that the officers don't have to make those difficult decisions. And expedite it. And in a lot of cases they're frightened of making positive decisions because, you know, there's an amenity society over here that's objecting, and there's, you know, they've got 20 or 30 objections from over there, and heritage officers saying all this stuff. Biodiversity net gain on small sites is a challenge. We just need to deliver, and I think that this mechanism could be a way of doing that.
So, I think we could go on and on, but I'm very conscious that I'm being waved at from the back of the room in terms of timings. So, very quickly, 30 seconds each for the panel. Just key takeaway, please. What would you want to leave this audience with?
I would say where the relationships lie, and building on those relationships. And actually, when you come into local authority, there's sometimes the tendency to just go straight to planning. There are officers in the housing area that know the people and know what their needs are, and having those conversations can actually bring insight into actually what would be palatable from a planning perspective. So I think if you can find other relationships to build during that design phase, and maybe have conversations with people who are going to live in the units, those are the things that I think might help to inform planning in the right way.
Great, thank you. John?
I think that 15 more people now know what LDOs are than existed 45 minutes ago, so that's a positive. The other one is we've got the existing framework to provide these solutions, so let's explore it further and actually crack on and be using them.
Fantastic. Mary?
I think reflecting on our discussion and the whole of today, obviously risk is not planning's friend, so de-risk and action, and that's what we need to do.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. I think what's frustrating is that we have all the tools, we have the land, we have the planning policies, we have the need, we have the money, everything is there. I just don't understand why we're not getting on with it. And you know, that's the thing, we need to just execute, don't we? We just need to execute somehow. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great point to leave it on, so thank you. If I could ask you to thank the thanks to Womble Dickinson for sponsoring the panel and enabling it to happen today. I think we are now going back into the next room for closing remarks. Thank you, everyone.